Okay, thank you very much to be here. And I would like to thank Shani Peer of the Maison Française, Mark Mazower and Robert Paxton to be here. And so I would like to speak about resistance in Western Europe. So just remember that in 1940, Great Britain faced a very difficult situation. In fact, on the one hand, it was sure to avoid defeat. It had won the Battle of Britain and knew that the Germans would never invade the islands. But on the other hand, it remained puzzled. To avoid a defeat was one thing, but to win the war was another kettle of fish. So how hence to defeat Germany? Great Britain, in fact, had very, very few assets. I hope there is no Brits in the audience, but just remember that it was a very small country. Its land routes were ridiculously small, a datum which prevented a landing on the continent. So it had to rely on its two main trucks. First, the Royal Navy, and second, the Royal Air Force. So the best way, according to British generals, was to lead a war of attrition on peripheral theatres of operations. A datum which explains that Great Britain mainly fought until 1943 in the Middle East, but subversive warfare was also an option. So my main aim is to see how the Anglo-Americans have tried in Western Europe to enforce and to support subversive warfare. Western Europe. I am not sure of this definition because it includes Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and Italy, but these countries have not been chosen at random. All were, from the spot, the potential theatre of military operations. Neither London nor Washington have seriously envisaged to land in the Balkans, even if Churchill had dreamed of that. Eastern Europe was equally too far to become an Anglo-American battlefield. So Western Europe was, on the contrary, a promising area. The Anglo-Americans could there wage subversive warfare and plan a true cooperation between regular and irregular troops when the day will come. From this point of view, irregular warfare was both appealing and promising. So what were English views about this question? In fact, we have to mention that the Brits seriously considered subversive warfare because they had experienced subversive warfare during, for example, the Boers War, the Irish Independence War, or even the Civil War in Russia. Just mention, for example, that Colin Gubbins, who became head of the Special Operations Executive from 1943 onwards, was General Ironsides aide-de-camp in Russia. And so, between 1919 and 1922, he served in Ireland, where he fought Michael Collins' so-called bandits. So no one could be surprised to see that in 1939, he wrote a report entitled Investigation of the Possibilities of Guerrilla Activities. On another level, many leftists thought that oppression led necessarily to revolt. Such was the case of Hugh Dalton, the head of the Ministry of Economic Warfare. He says, we have on our side not only the anti-Nazi elements in Germany and Austria, but also the whole of the democratic and liberty-loving elements in Norway, Denmark, Belgium. I am convinced that the potentialities of this war from within are really immense. Just remember equally that the successes of Nazi and Soviet propaganda suggested at last that radio had an overwhelming power. By delivering an appropriate propaganda, the Allies could hope to win the war at a very low cost. So, the British put powerful means to develop subversive warfare. In the UK, the Ungentlemanly War, to take Churchill's word, depended on three main institutions. Intelligence was the realm of MI6, the famous secret intelligence service. Propaganda was devoted to the political warfare executive, which had been created in August 1941. And action was, at last, dedicated to a new service, the Special Operations Executive, which was aimed, to take Churchill's word, to set Europe ablaze. So the Brits had the means to implement subversive warfare. But how? At the very beginning, the British really thought that Western Europe was on the verge of sedition. As SOE depended on the Ministry of Economic Warfare, Hugh Dalton summoned a symposium on revolution on the 19th of October 1940. Here was the program. Among the questions which he would like discussed were what types of revolutions were possible in the different territories, how far could we produce one type of revolution rather than another. And so he tried to find the recipe of revolutions. I have a scoop. He never found a scoop, of course. But many British leaders stated that peoples were ready to struggle. From this point of view, the SOE could help to inflame such a sensitive barrel of powder. That was the detonator factor, to quote the historian David Stafford. But unfortunately, this dream rapidly sank. In fact, you had social and political movements in France, in the Netherlands. For example, you had a great protest launched against the anti-Semitic persecution in Amsterdam in February 1941. You had also very important strike in coal mines in Belgium and in France in May, June 1941. But all failed and all ended in a bloodbath. Just remember equally that in 1941, two very important events took place. First, of course, Barbarossa, and secondly, of course, Pearl Harbor. That means that both Russia and the US came into the war. Then, war could be led in a more traditional way than by subversion. That means that generals and admirals were quite happy by this evolution because very traditional generals and very traditional admirals were not convinced by subversive warfare. That means that from 1941, 1942 onwards, the British still considered seriously resistance, but they reduced, they downscaled their ambitions. According to them, resistance had two main missions. First, masses. Masses were supposed to hinder the German war effort by working slowly and showing more or less openly that the occupier was an unwelcomed guest. And so the BBC launched several campaigns in 1941, 1942, and the motto was go slow for the workers, or have to take an ice front attitude toward the occupier, a cold shoulder policy toward the occupier. Peoples were not supposed to revolt because the Allies feared bloody reprisals. But you had masses, but you had also some happy fews. Before the landings, a handful of professional resistors would endeavor sabotages, targeting very precise objectives, plants, electric power stations, and so on. And around the D-Day and after the D-Day, their task would be to paralyze enemy communications and also, which is sometimes forgotten, to enforce an anti-earth scorch policy to protect little installations. But Just remember that guerrilla and uprising were discouraged. The general staff thought that poorly trained and equipped resistors would never be able to oppose the German war machine. But this strategy, which was clear, was very difficult to enforce. The first problem, of course, was to deal with governments in exile or de facto authorities. So, in fact, in some cases, it was not so much complicated. Just remember, for example, that in Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, governments and sometimes chiefs of state had crossed the channel in 1940. That means that London could deal with regular governments which had crossed the channel and which spent the war in London. But in other cases, such as Denmark, such as Italy, such as France, of course, the case was much more difficult. For France, as you know, they had to deal with de Gaulle, and de Gaulle was not an easygoing man. You know that, according to Churchill, the heaviest cross he had to bear was the Lorraine Cross during the war. But Norwegians, Dutch, Belgians, all, however, despite the differences of the status, all refused to consider that their country could become a playground where the British Secret Service could act freely. And just give one example. In 1941, two raids targeted the Lofoten Islands in the north of Norway, which were considered as a very promising target. In fact, a very important target. Why? Because they were producing herring oil, which was very important. Why? Because herring oil was rich in A and B vitamins which were crucial for German crews operating in submarines. So, to strike on herring oils was a way to win the Battle of the Atlantic. So, these bold raids were a success. About 16 factories were destroyed, but after, the Germans launched severe reprisals. They burned houses, they deported males, so the toll was quite heavy. The Norwegian authorities were shocked. Was the game worth the candle? In the French case, also, clashes frequently occurred because the French secret services, the Viciera, and their British counterparts disagreed about many topics. So, on the whole, the question of power was the main stake. Who was supposed to lead the battle? The British claimed for the lead. They had a global vision of the war. They had a global strategy. So they had to be in command. National governments claimed for the lead because war was led in their country. And local resistors, at last, also claimed for the lead. They were on the spot. They were on the field. And so they were in the best situation to appreciate what was possible and what was not. All these elements clearly show that political and military questions overlapped. What was the best solution? Silence or noise? The Secret Intelligence Service, of course, claimed for silence to allow his men to collect intelligence. SOE pleaded for sabotages, but by attracting attention, they attracted repression, and so they hampered the work of MI6 agents. And so the situation was so tense that, for example, in Sweden, the British ambassador was so scared that he obliged the head of SOE in Stockholm, who was working under the coverage of press attaché, to do his work. He hoped that he would be overwhelmed by his work of attaché and that he would not devote any time to the secret services. This hope was, of course, it was a disappointment for the ambassador to see that, in fact, the SOE head in Stockholm was able to do the two missions. Finally, an agreement was reached: no ban without foreign office consent, especially, as you may suppose, in neutral countries, Spain, Sweden, Turkey. In the same way, was status quo better than commitment? This question was particularly relevant in Denmark, because in Denmark, the king and political parties had decided to bargain with Berlin in 1940. They obtained the right to rule the country against political neutrality and diplomatic compliance with the Reich. London, at first, supported this strategy because Christian X was considered as a friend of Great Britain. But this British support was very discouraging for resistors. So the SOE chief organizer, Flemming Moos, decided to grasp the NATO. In 1942, you had 59 sabotages, but they suddenly reached a climax in 1943, 816. Why? Because Moos played a strategy of tension to oblige the Danes to choose. They did. In August, the Germans ordered Danish authorities to arrest saboteurs and to shoot them. Of course, it was impossible for the Danish Prime Minister, Scavenius, to obey, so he resigned, and the Germans took control of the country. The time of ambiguity was over. So, as you may see, politics, sovereignty, and military states were closely interlinked, which explains that the question of command was still pending in 1943, as much as a new partner came into the arena, the United States of America. At first, just remember, that's very funny to remember that, the US were not anxious to create secret services, because many Republicans thought that secret services could give the state, Leviathan, too much power. And also, as you may suppose, they were not very hot new dealers. But William Donovan, however, succeeded to convince Roosevelt. And so in June 1942, intelligence and action were run by a newly created service, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, while propaganda belonged to the Office of War Information. At the beginning, which is also very funny, Americans were very shy. As Malcolm Muggeridge, a writer who was working for MI6, recalls, the Americans were like innocent girls from a finishing school, anxious to learn the seasoned demi-mondaine ways of the old practitioners, in this case, the legendary British Secret Services. Perfidious Albion took advantage of the situation. In June 1942, an agreement was reached between the Brits and the Yankees. The Americans would take the lead in China, in Finland, in the Southwest Pacific, and in Northwest Africa. That means nowhere except China. And the Brits, all the rest of the world was the realm of SOE. It was quite an equal agreement. Much more, the Brits were not ready to share their secrets. As the head of SOE put it bluntly in January 1943, SOE must reserve certain of its most intimate secrets, even from our allies. In fact, from anybody who has not sworn allegiance to the British sovereign and Commonwealth. It was obviously the case of the Americans. So cooperation between the Brits and the Americans was very complicated because the Brits wanted to control everything. But propaganda was also a problem. On the one hand, the Anglo-Americans ignored which message to deliver. Why? Because the BBC, which was very proud of itself, refused to make propaganda. We must give the truth as we see it, not from bogus propaganda angle, explained Noel Newsom, who was chairing the European News Service. This position, as you may suppose, complicated the task of the propagandist. The Anglo-American propaganda, on the other hand, appeared to be stern compared to the Soviet one. What could London and Washington promise to the Europeans? Their message was focused on the Atlantic Charter, but this message appeared stern compared to the rich promises of socialism. And a joke revealed this aporia. Two Englishmen were reading newspapers in a train. Suddenly, one said, well, we are not doing so badly. And the other retorted, you talk remarkably good English for a Russian. Last but not least, propaganda was floating between the rock and the whirlpool. It was supposed to strengthen the determination of oppressed people while avoiding to foster unrealistic hopes. On the 14th of January 1941, for example, the Belgian francophone speaker Victor de la Vedette suggested his fellow citizens to draw the V sign, V as victory, on the wall. And this campaign was a huge success. All over Europe, V flourished, V signs flourished. But this campaign was too successful. And Anthony Eden, who led the Foreign Office, ordered to Brendan Bracken, the Minister of Information, that, I quote, the campaign should not pass from the field of harmless agitation to that of incitement to action, leading to sabotage or revolt. And on the 8th of May 1942, the V campaign was suspended. London was not willing oppressed people to cross the Rubicon. So all these elements clearly show that waging subversive warfare in Western Europe was a very difficult task. But the Anglo-American, however, took up the challenge. The Anglo-Americans first launched a few sabotages. To do so, they sent small parties in order to destroy some key sites. The most famous story is about the destruction of the Vemork factory, which produced in Norway heavy water, which was a key component for the atomic bomb. So on the 16th of February 1943, a party conveyed by leaders succeeded in destroying the Vemork factory. Some remnants got back to Sweden after a long and painful travel, 1,400 kilometers by ski in the snow. The Anglo-Americans, in the same way, tried to support local resistors by sending emissaries, chief organizers, radio transmitters, and so on. They could support local organizations. Such was the case in Norway, where the military organization, Milorg, was given weapons and money. In France or in Denmark, on the contrary, SOE or OSS created their own organizations. The results were uneven. It was quite difficult for SOE and OSS to find volunteers speaking fluently, for example, Danish or Norwegian. And sometimes SOE blindness turned to disaster. For example, two important agents had been dropped in the Netherlands in November 1941. They were soon arrested, but one agreed to transmit messages under the German control. This game lasted more than a year. 43 SOE agents were caught. Money, weapons were caught. The agent, however, had deliberately made mistakes in his telegrams to warn that he was writing under constraint. SOE retorted, "You are speaking a very bad English." But the Anglo-Americans were much more successful in their fight against forced labor. It was, of course, a very important stake because forced labor helped the German war machine. To fight against it, on the contrary, would show the ability of inner resistance to protect their fellow citizens. In summer 1943, for example, SOE dropped 2 agents in charge of creating a clandestine organization in Belgium. Socrates, it was his name, was supposed to prevent skilled workers from going to Germany. And to do so, they were paid. On the whole, between 27,000 and 50,000 civilians avoided deportation, which was a very impressive result. A main difference, however, distinguishes the French and the Belgian case. In Belgium, the idea was to help Dutch drafters to hide. In France, the idea was to transform them in resistors, which was not the same logic. No one can be surprised that the Anglo-Americans did nothing for the French draftees. It is a considered opinion of the British government that maintaining an army of 40 to 50,000 men for an indeterminable span of time is impossible. That was the answer given to de Gaulle. So the British, as the American authorities, refused to encourage uprisings and guerrillas on a large scale. They had, in fact, other views. So, thanks to the experience gained from 1942 onwards, British and American generals had a clear vision of what could be expected from the resistance. They first hoped clandestine troops to sabotage the German defenses, especially by cutting their communication networks. They were also anxious to preserve vital installations, and they were, on the contrary, reluctant toward guerrilla and uprising. To enforce this vision, the Anglo-Americans began to draft plans, which were, for example, sent to France in 1943. The Green Plan, for example, detailed the main cuts to be done on the French railways. In the same vein, they obliged inner resistances to adopt a decentralized chain of command. Oppositions were fierce for resistors and power in exile, because they preferred a centralized organization which was easier to control. But they lost the battle, and all European countries were divided in regions. So the Allies were able to deliver their order directly to the regions without asking the approval of a central national command. In the same way, the command of inner resistance was at first assumed by London through SOE or OSS. In Italy, however, it shifted to army groups at fall 1943. The same process was adopted for the Northwestern European Theatre of Operations, where resistance forces were commanded by Schaff. General Koenig, for example, was integrated in this headquarters, and to break national susceptibilities, the Dutch and Norwegian crown princes received the theoretical command of clandestine forces, which were equally incorporated to Ike's headquarters. But the question of weapons remained crucial. Scarcity was the rule, and this datum has involved a dark legend. And this dark legend is still vivid. Maybe they were afraid the resistance would play too great a role in the liberation of the country, asserted, for example, Jean-Pierre Vernant, who was a French resistor. But the reality, however, is simpler. First, the RAF and the US Air Force were reluctant to drop weapons because they thought that they could obtain victory by bombing Germany. From this point of view, helping the resistance was just diverting in vain very precious bombers. Dropping containers was equally very complicated. Packing containers was a complex process. Parachutes were missing, and reception groups sometimes failed to be present in the dropping zones. On the whole, one mission on three failed because of the weather, because of the German defenses, because of all this kind of stuff. The risk, to sum up, was high. However, resistance paid good dividends. In Italy, for example, the Allied advance in the country was greatly helped by partigiani. In the north, partigiani pinned 6 of the 25 German divisions which were fighting in this theater of operation. In France, they equally played a great part. French resistors made more than 1,000 railway cuts on and around the day, and they equally served as scouts or as guards. The support of resistance has been invaluable, remarked George Patton. Resistors were assisted by the Allies. More than 200 missions were dispatched in Italy and in France. Jailbird teams and operational groups helped French forces to fight. Taking into account these very good results, the Allies finally decided to arm resistors. On the whole, 47,000 of material has been dropped in Western Europe during the war, but more than 90% have been delivered in 1944 only. Moreover, the Americans used deliveries to increase their prestige and to beat the Brits. Ike's chief of staff, Donald Smith, favored this move in March 1944, but avoided to inform Roosevelt, because Roosevelt was a fierce anti-Gaullist. This point, he said in his note, was most emphatic. This cornucopia was, of course, useful, but it had 2 drawbacks. First, it encouraged widespread guerrillas, as was the case in France. In France, de Gaulle never heard nobody, and especially the Americans, and so he supported great maquis. His dream was to free large French areas without the Allied support. As you may suppose, in Monchay, Vercors, Saint-Marcel, these little wars turned in bloodbaths, which confirmed the sad premonitions of Allied officers. The Vercors, concludes an OSS officer, only, I quote, demonstrates the age-old principle that resistant forces cannot hold territory, but must be fluid and adhere strictly to basic guerrilla tactics. And the second flaw was, as you may suppose, to give weapons to undesirable fighters. Generally speaking, the Anglo-Americans were haunted by the memory of World War I. They remembered the deep troubles which had burst out in 1917, and so they were firmly decided to avoid these troubles. But the gap between inner resistance on the one hand and powers in exile on the other was also a worry. So the first move of the Allies was to support regular powers. But regular powers were sometimes very compromised. For example, in North Africa, the Anglo-Americans, and especially the Americans, sustained Darlan until the bitter end. In Italy, they equally supported the king, Victor Emmanuel, and his prime minister, Piero Badoglio, despite their shameful past. But this policy was very unpopular. For example, a gap widened in Denmark between the resistance movement and the old parties, as they were named. Resistors, of course, judged these old parties very severely. They had, they said, helped the Germans and discouraged the Danish to join the Shadow Army. So they created a body, a Council of Freedom, on the 16th of September 1943, to create a clandestine government. But this view was, of course, unacceptable for traditional politicians who considered the Freedom Council as, I quote, a foreign body which had made its sudden entry on the political stage without mandates. They were equally unacceptable for the Allies, who claimed to command the resistance. So, negotiations began in Stockholm in 1944 and led to a compromise. The Freedom Council was supposed to command the resistance until an eventual landing, but the Freedom Council will let power to the shaft after. In the same way, the old parties agreed to share power in May 1944. The new cabinet would associate on an equal footing members of the Freedom Council and representatives of traditional forces. In the same way, the Anglo-Americans tried to bridge the gap between the resistors operating in northern Italy, that means clandestinely. They were represented by the Comitato di Liberazione Nazionale della Italia and the government, which was settled in Roma. The CNLI wanted to be recognized by the government, but the government was scared. It thought that recognition could favor a coup. The Anglo-Americans hence obliged the two camps to reach an agreement. These agreements, the Roman protocols, were signed on the 7th of December 1944 between the Allies and the CNLI. The committee would follow the Allies' directives and recognize the Italian government. It will also receive 160 million liras a month, but would be considered as the legal representative of Roma in northern Italy. The same agreement, after, was made between the Bodoni government in Roma and the CNLI on the 26th December 1944, but under the British and Anglo-American eyes. A glass of something, a word of two, a handshake, and then the signing. I ask myself if whenever the British proconsuls sign agreements with the Sultan of Baluchistan or the Hadramaut is not a little the same, wondered Ferruccio Pari, who belonged to the Italian delegation. But, of course, as you may suppose, communists were the main worry. Did they plan the coup? This fear was very widespread in the high spheres, but on the spot, in the fields, officers were not worried. In Norway, observed an OSS officer, they do not want to waste their energies on a political showdown which they well know would only serve to defeat the ends they can gain by unity. And they were right. In fact, Stalin did not want revolution. When Maurice Torres was supposed to go back to France, he was received by Stalin, and Stalin said to Torres, Maurice, don't play the fool. The time is not ripe for revolution. We have first to win the war. So winning the war was the overriding priority for Moscow. And so Western Europe hence escaped both revolution and civil war, and law and order were preserved. So it's time to conclude. I would like to stress some points. First, resistance in Western Europe has been strengthened and supported by the Anglo-Americans. Of course, neither London nor Washington have created European resistance. Movements and networks came from the ground. But movements, networks, resistance organizations would have been unable to grow if they had not been supported by the US and the UK. The US and the UK provided weapons, money, and means of transmission, and these were, in fact, key elements. Resistance, second element, has played a minor part on the military ground. In fact, resistors were not able to face the German army because they had no means to wage a modern warfare, because modern warfare lies upon mobility and firepower, and resistors were deprived of these two means. 3. London and Washington have also played an important part in the battle of legitimacy. They failed to maintain devaluated powers, such as Darlan and Victor Emmanuel, which was their first move. But they succeeded in settling compromises between inner and outer resistances in Belgium, in Norway, in Italy, and so on. I am not, of course, speaking of Greece. This datum has totally been forgotten, which is not surprising. I am quoting Peter Lagoux, a Belgian historian. Being liberated was too passive a mode to celebrate the recovery of national independence, and gratitude is a weak basis for national identity. For Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, glorification of the contribution of the resistance movement was the only basis available for a true national myth. But this myth, we have been able to liberate ourselves alone. And this myth, which was settled by the famous speech of de Gaulle in August 1944, this speech was also common in Norway and in Denmark. For example, in Denmark, resistance was considered as a growing tide in league with the British who supplied the means. The Allies were not stupid, and they realized that their contribution would soon be forgotten. The British embassy noticed, sadly, in 1945, that the French would, I quote, very soon forget what had been done for them, and might be more inclined to remember things that had not been done. From that extent, my book is also a way to recall the Anglo-American support to inner resistances, but be sure, many Europeans do not forget that. Thank you.
So, first of all, is this on? Can you hear? No. I don't think it's on. Okay. So, get closer.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I would like to begin by congratulating Olivier Wieviorka on this work. I've spent a lot of time in the historical trenches, but I never tried to cover 6 countries in the detail that he's done, and it's an extremely impressive achievement given the size and the scope of the work that has to be done. It's not as though the resistance had never been written about. There's volumes and volumes of books about the resistance, and in fact, that's part of the trouble. We've all grown up with 3 images: the train that blows up, the midnight parachute drop at a field with lamps showing the drop place, the radio broadcaster frantically getting his message out before the German direction finding equipment and finding the rescue. The local on the resistance on the ground is the image that we have, and Olivier has succeeded in vastly broadening the canvas and placing this domestic resistance in a much broader context that it deserved. Most of the books are, for a long time, were written by the veterans. They really handed up, and eventually they disappeared, and professional historians had to work on the subject. And this is a brilliant example of what needs to be done and what hasn't been done. So Olivier has placed the resistance under a different lens, a continental lens, and this is very important because this is the way the Allies saw it, and this is the way the Germans saw it. And it creates a whole new series of subjects about this 3-way power negotiation between the resistance units on the ground. Among the resistance units on the ground, there are representatives in London and the Anglo-Americans. Olivier has elucidated all that very brilliantly. This continental perspective allows us to make comparisons, because even though the problems faced by the resistance are similar, each national solution, each national outcome is distinctive, and it makes a fascinating tapestry. Now, there are a number of things in this book that we didn't have time to go into, and the book is extremely rich. One must be a sociologist, political scientist, as well as a historian. One wants to know who the resistors were and what their motives were. He talks about those issues in the book. He must read the book, it's not substitute for it. And he deals very effectively with a certain number of rumors. One rumor is that the resistance people were marginal. They participated in resistance because they were already detached from their own societies and were not subject to the limitations of more normal law-abiding people. He thoroughly destroys that legend. He talks about the social composition of resistance movements. Women were very important, although they don't figure in the traditional imagery. And so all of these areas are very important contributions. And then, of course, he relates the resistance to the course of the war, because there is a timeline that's extremely important. At the beginning, to resist was practically suicidal, at least after a few false starts. And one needed to have a certain amount of hope. There had to be a reasonable ground to suppose that we could accomplish something. And so there are turning points. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was mentioned. That was extremely important because it shifted the Communist Party from its the position it had held up to that time, which was to work underground, but not necessarily in favor of on the side of the Allies. It was to prepare their own positions for later on. So the first year, taking the French example, which I think could probably be generalized, the party members worked underground and acquired the skills for living and operating underground, but for their own purposes, for building on institutions. And they said, the outcome of the war this is not about the outcome of the war. It doesn't make much difference to us whether we are forced to live under the City of London and Churchill or under Churchill and the Krupp family. It's all the same. This is a capitalist war. It's not the war of the working people. And the French Communist Party propaganda urged the French to fraternize with the Germans and to work for a future which would be perhaps a future of revolution. Now, almost instantaneously, 21st and 2nd June 1941, Russia entered the war and the Communist parties entered the world of the domestic resistance on the Allied side, and they had great advantages because they were good on the ground. They'd been doing it for 2 years. They had highly committed people, and there was this huge debate, particularly again the French case, between instant action, which many communists favored, and waiting for D-Day, which was the Anglo-American preference. There was always this tension, and it was the communist positions in the resistance were extremely appealing, extremely attractive, because they promised immediate results. They offered outlets for heroic action and so forth. And the role of the Communist Party was extremely powerful and influential. And this was something that the resistance experience established on the ground. The role of women in the resistance, I mentioned, it figures largely in the book. Women were less suspect. They could get through inspections often more easily. They carried messages. They fed and sheltered the resistance people, or indeed they were active in action themselves. And in one case, Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, they were at the head of the directors of the resistance movement. So in many ways, the resistance changed social relationships and altered the societies which they were. Now, Olivier has gone into the tensions between Allied staffs in London and resistance, and that's a very important part of the story. but there were also tensions within the resistance movements between those who wanted to work for future revolution and those who mainly wanted to liberate the country. It was very difficult to unite these movements, and it was a remarkable achievement on the part of de Gaulle and the French case. Very now, Olivier has chosen the six leading countries of Western Europe. I'm not going to suggest that he should have included Eastern Europe, that would be out of the question, but it's worth mentioning in passing that the resistance movements in Eastern Europe were, that was quite a different history and a very important one. In that case, it was possible to liberate some territory in Yugoslavia, and large numbers of partisans operated behind German lines, and the Germans did devote considerable resources to defeating them. It was a very different story, and it's worth keeping in mind. Now I'd like to return to the issue of bombing versus sabotage, because I think that is extremely interesting. The resistance offered the possibility of taking out targets like railroad tracks and bridges and power plants and so forth without collateral damage in the neighborhood, and a lot of this was in fact done in preparation for D-Day, for example. But a lot of planners were always skeptical about what the resistance could do and couldn't do, and they were unwilling to give up bombing as the last resort. And so we went ahead and bombed the bridges and the power plants and the port facilities and so forth, and we absolutely leveled many of the cities of coastal France, neighborhoods of Paris. Almost no one in this country is aware that 60,000 French people were killed by Allied bombing. We remember the British dead, which was about 34,000, but the British dead under German bombing was just a little over half of the French dead under Allied bombing. Another part of the story. Now, I'll terminate with the $64,000 question. Resistance activity is extremely costly. A lot of people were arrested and killed. The heads of the local resistance organizations, it was an extraordinary turnover. One group would be arrested and taken off, and other leaders would emerge. And furthermore, resistance activities endangered the local population, and therefore they were not particularly popular. You might think that patriotic Europeans would be thrilled that some of their young men were trying to fight the Germans, but not if it meant that the Germans would arrive and blow up their village and kill a lot of people. And so there was a high cost to this, and as has been suggested, it did not really change the outcome of the war. So was it really worth it?
So I think the fundamental question for me is why write the history of resistance, and why write the history of resistance today? And we were asked to think of questions to ask Professor people. So that's my basic question, but I want to explain a little bit about what I mean. There was a curious sense for me of coming full circle here, because when I started to get interested in the question of resistance, it was in the mid to late 1980s, and I am a Brit, and I was interested in Greece, and so I found myself in seminars and workshops and conferences, and some seeming to me elderly Greek would get up and say, you bloody fascists, you bombed us, and you were all really in alliance with the Nazis, and then some incredibly well-spoken British gent would get up and say, well, actually, I happened to be in this at that time, and they were all commies. And so I got to know lots of people involved, and it was clear to me that in Greece there not only or for Greece, but not only for Greece, the subject at that time, if you're interested in the Second World War, was the history of the resistance. I think this was true in general of I can't remember exactly what it was called, the International Committee for the History of the Second World War. A lot of it was being staffed by former résistants turned scholars and historians. And they were, of course, reliving their past. And so it was a massive question, you know, had it been worth it? Should SOE have done more? Or should MI6 have got out of the way? And so you went off to the Athenaeum to interview some chap from SOE if he'd gone to a good public school, or Special Forces Club if he'd gone to a bad one. You went to White's if you found somebody from MI6, and you soon got a sense for all the gradations of this, and they were very, very important, and you could spend your entire life discussing this stuff that had been discussed at the time, and they were going to go on discussing it ever since. And the early historiography on Second World War Greece was essentially Allied policy towards Greece, meaning, you know, Foreign Office versus SOE with MI6 and the Americans playing kind of a big part. And so the answer, the implicit answer to the question, why study the resistance, was to, well, there was very specific answers in the Greek case, but the general answer was, had it all been worth it? This was the question Professor Paxton asked. And then I think something changed, and I have to say, I think productively in historiography, and it changed starting before the fall of the Iron Curtain, but definitely as a result of the end of the Cold War. And people started thinking, well, you know, maybe the resistance was important for another reason than for this discussion of Allied strategy. You know, the reason why studying resistance is important is actually we want to know how the nation state, and especially the democratic nation state in Europe, was rescued, if you want to use Alan Milner's term, or revived itself. And you cannot answer that question unless you see the immense ideological and political and moral ferment in occupied Europe that took place within and outside the resistance. But the resistance was a locus for this. So the great work on this, of course, is Claudio Pavoni's work on Italy, La Guerra Civile, than which there is none better. And that exposed the whole thing, was an inspiration. So that it was curious and interesting to me to read Professor Wiewierka's very wide-ranging book, which is very much a book about the relations between the various Allied services and the resistance organizations. I don't want to say, why did you write a different kind of book? That's a silly question, but I do want to say, why did you write this kind of book? Why did you write this kind of book now? You hinted at it, actually, in your very final sentences. You implied, I think, that there was some special purpose now. Perhaps when you wrote it in 1617, maybe more or less now, I don't know, to wanting, as a historian of the French resistance, to resuscitate the history of the Anglo-American contribution. But I would like to hear something more from you on that. And that's connected to a second question. I only have two other questions really. You say at the start that you want to tell a European story. And I want to know more about what you mean by a European story. If you mean by a European story that the British and the Americans had to think holistically about Europe because the Germans were across Europe, then it's clearly a European story. Is that the sense in which you mean to talk about a European story? Because if that's the sense of Europe, that strikes me as a fairly weak sense of Europe, and that might also help us understand some things about the situation that Europe is in today. Or is there a different sense of Europe that you have in mind? And then the third and last thing is to do with socialism and the left. One of the features of the approach when you see things to a certain extent from Bletchley Park or from Whitehall is that the left tends to drop out of the picture, or else the left is a bit of a nuisance because it connects to this whole revolutionary anxiety that you're talking about. One of the things that I've seen almost nothing on, and that may be because there was nothing there, is whether there were any conversations during the war, and I imagine there had to have been some, between the British and Americans on the one hand and the Soviets on the other hand, about policy towards resistance. That really would interest me because I've seen almost nothing on that. And I know there were conversations at the very end of the war, for instance, on the repatriation of SOE agents who had fallen into Red Army hands and so on. But I would be very interested to know what you were able to find about any such conversations that happened during the war. And now I've been put in charge of questions for the remaining time. So I could perhaps suggest that Professor Wiewierka answers our questions, if that's all right with you, and then we will open the floor.
Okay, so thank you for these wonderful remarks, and I'd like to answer these questions. First, why I have written this book. I think that the situation is not the same today than that it used to be, I would say, 20 or 30 years before. I think that 20 or 30 years before, resistance was considered as a source of inspiration. And you had all the theme of, for example, the betrayed revolution. And resistance was, to a certain extent, the place where a new world could have been born. And I think that it was very important for Greek people, for example, but also for French people. And this, for example, has been very important in 1968, where people, demonstrators, thought that they were, to a certain extent, the ears of resistors, because they were not communists. But today, I think that what is interesting, and I wrote this book at I began 8 years ago, it was also because of the question of the Middle East, also the question elsewhere in Eastern Europe. And the question is, why people do not revolt? And why, for example, in Iraq, why, for example, in Syria, why there is no revolt, or why, when they revolt, they fail? And I think that it was very important to understand that, first of all, a guerrilla is very, very seldom able to seize power. It happens sometimes, just for example in Cuba. But elsewhere, just look at Syria, it was not possible, it has not been possible. That means that a foreign support is very important. But this foreign support, today we think that it's easy. It's very difficult to understand the foreign support. For example, today, if you want to support opponents in Syria, who will you choose? Who is legitimate? And of course, I am not dealing with this kind of topic in my book, but it was in the background, it was in the foreground, you see, of my reflection. And especially because of the situation in Iraq. And that's the first question. The second element, a European story. You are perfectly right. It's not a real European story. Because, in fact, there is a kind of storytelling. And the storytelling is that the European construction is born because of World War II. And in the European construction, resistors and deportees have played a great part. That's, I think, totally irrelevant. Why? Because they were nationalists. De Gaulle was a nationalist, he was certainly not a European. And so, the European idea was not born, you see, in London. On the contrary, each country was trying to preserve, each country was trying to defend its own national interest. And of course, the Brits and the Yankees played, you see, on these tensions. That means that what was European to a certain extent was the Anglo-American vision. And this Anglo-American vision was, for example, the cradle for the NATO. I think that to a certain extent, if there is a bequest, NATO, that means that neutrality is impossible. What is very interesting, for example, was that Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, all believed that neutrality was a shield against Nazism. And during the war, they realized that it has not been a shield. And so they began, and we see that with Trygve, the Minister for Foreign Affairs in Norway, they began to think that they had to build a common defense helped by Great Britain, which was supposed to be a great power, and the US. And so that is a European dimension, which is the European dimension of security. Third, about Russia and the Western world, there were very, very few connections. You have a very interesting book about resistance in Soviet Union. There was no help given by the Western world to the Soviet resistance. On the contrary, Soviet resistors were closely linked with the headquarters of the Red Army. And what is fascinating is that communists in Western Europe were not waiting for the Russian help, except maybe to a certain extent in Norway, because the Soviet Union was not too far. But when you see, for example, the communists in France, they look at London, and certainly not at Moscow, because Moscow was too poor, the range of the planes was not sufficient to drop weapons and so on. So they did not help. They gave orders. There were, in fact, radio transmitters, but they gave no help. That means that communists relied, which is to a certain extent surprising, on the Anglo-Americans. And when Russia asked the British or the Americans to drop Soviet agents or communist agents, the British or the American secret services refused because they said, in France, Giraud will certainly not agree. So you see, there was no cooperation between Russia and the Anglo-Americans, but there was no cooperation. There was no more cooperation on the military ground. The only cooperation was to a certain extent between the landings in Normandy, 6th of June 1944, and the Bagration thrust on the 22nd of August, but it was just a synchronization and certainly not a cooperation. Each headquarter was making their plans on their part alone.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions. Perhaps if you want to ask a question, you could put up your hand, and when you ask it, just say briefly as well. Is there a voting microphone? We have a question over on the far left.
I can reject.
Jim, can you hang on to the mic? Sure, thank you. And if you just say who you are. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Jim Damon. Thank you so much. I look forward to reading the book. I wanted to globalize this because if you're looking at other aspects of resistance warfare in World War II, you have in the question of the Cold War, the question of what happens with the Dixie mission in Vietnam, or what happens with the Deer mission in Vietnam, which is always looked at a what if, and remains to this day a big what if. In the case of Eastern Europe, you have the fact that there was the thwarted airlift to support the AK in Warsaw when they rose, which is also looked on as a Cold War moment. And then, of course, we talk about what the markets done. I think of the fighting in September of 1944 in Athens and the fall, which are different. So I'm just wondering, one can, of course, look at the Western European part of this as one way. But then, of course, the OSS and the SOE both waging a global war. And I'm wondering how you see those other situations in contrast to the ones you talk about in your book.
Thank you very much. It's, of course, a very, very interesting question. In fact, if I have well understood, you have many questions. The first one is what about the global war? In fact, OSS and SOE were waging a global war, but it was a very, very different war on the eastern side than in the eastern side. In fact, the help given, for example, to Polish resistors was very negligible, very, very, very small, except, as we have said, during the Warsaw Uprising. And here there is a connection because all the weapons given to the Polish resistors were not given to Italian resistors. And so there was a crisis, you see, in August and September 1944 because of this support. But in fact, except some operations, for example, Heydrich assassination, I think that in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, SOE and OSS have played a very minor role. In Greece and in Yugoslavia, but I am a very good specialist, so I am very shy about that, I would say that the idea of SOE and the idea of OSS was to wage war by proxy. So they gave, in fact, a lot of weapons to Yugoslavs, first Grigorievic and then Tito, but they did not want to intervene. So it was another kettle of fish. You see, it was another way of proceeding in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. The other question I think that you have asked was about the question of Cold War, guerrilla, Vietnam, and so on. So has it been, and the question was asked by Robert Paxton, was it efficient? What is very, I would say two things. First of all, of course, this subversive warfare has inflamed imagination after the war. So it had been studied. But what is interesting is to mention that it has been studied in a bilateral way. There were no real global conception of subversive warfare, and this has been well studied by Elite and Baum. It showed that the British tried, for example, to have lessons learned from France, then to apply, I don't know, in Kenya against the Momo, but there was not a global frame, you see, to imagine what was subversive warfare. And that's the first answer. The second one is that when we are speaking of guerrilla and so on, when we are speaking of Vietnam or Indochina, it was not guerrilla. In Dien Bien Phu, it was a real battle, you see. That means that in China, during the Civil War and during the Indochina War, I would say the genius of Jiang, for example, was to transform an army, you see, of resistors in a kind of real army. And so in Dien Bien Phu, it was not guerrilla, it was a real battle. And after, also, of course, you had some elements of guerrilla in the south, but not in the north.
Thank you so much. Excuse me, my name is Katie, and I'm a writer focused on this very topic, and I'm really curious about how you would describe the evolution of French-American relations over time as the perception versus the history of what happened has evolved, and how the friendships have been either maintained or established. How have you observed that relationship?
You mean during the war?
The relationships born between the resistance and
during
the
the war.
Americans during the war, and how
So I would say that during the war, the OSS at first did not take resistance, the French resistance, seriously. But after, they began to understand that it could play a very important part. And a man has played a very important part in that it's Allen Dulles, who was in Bern, but he has also a global focus. And Allen Dulles really wanted to support the French resistance as he wanted to support Italian resistors. So relationships were good. What was not was the relationship between SOE and OSS. Because at first, you see, as I have said, the Americans were very shy, and so the SOE was taking the lead, but suddenly OSS realized that to a certain extent they were fooled. And what is very interesting is about the Affaire Suisse. You know that? So in 1943, Allen Dulles proposed to Henri Freinet, who was leading the movement Cuba, which was a very important organization, to finance Cuba. And there was a deep crisis, and when you read today French historiography, for example, Daniel Cordier, who is the former Jean Moulin's secretary, but who is also an historian, he thinks that Henri Freinet has played an anti-Gaullist part, which has not been the case. Freinet thought that he was loyal towards de Gaulle. And when all that collapsed, it was not because of the action of de Gaulle saying to Freinet, you are a bad French, and so on. It was because SOE reacted and forbade the Americans, you see, to support the French resistance, because that was their dream. That's why Bedell Smith and Eisenhower, who were, from this point of view, much more clever than Roosevelt, wanted to have good relations, because they said, after the war, we would have to cooperate with France, and so we have now to support them by giving weapons and so on. That's why you had, for example, 3 very important daylight operations in 1944 with huge dropping of weapons. You see, by Super Fortress, you see, very important to show that the Americans were supporting the French. And the Americans were very friendly towards the French, especially when they had been dropped in occupied France. So you have very, and they were not fearing communism. On the spot, they were not fearing communism. So the Red Scare was maybe a reality in Washington, D.C., but certainly not on the spot. But if you have this attitude of the Americans, don't forget that de Gaulle ruled the country. And when liberation came, de Gaulle very brutally expelled all English and American agents, saying you have nothing to do here. So you see, I would say the toughness was on the French Gaullist side rather than on the American one.
One last question? Yeah.
If I might restate Professor Paxton's
Would you
question.
say who you are?
Oh, my name is Douglas Morris. If I might restate Professor Paxton's question also for Professor Paxton. It's a question of political morality. When you're in conditions of extreme oppression in which the individual can never accomplish anything on his or her own, in which the consequences of whatever action the individual takes are unpredictable and can cause pain and suffering to other people, can also have unintended consequences. What's the moral basis for an individual acting in such tyrannical circumstance, or should someone be an indifferent bystander?
So it's a very, very interesting question, but of course there is a moral dimension in that. But what is very important to notice is that this moral dimension is very frequently a bequest of the pre-war period. And Mark Mazower has shown that in his book, that you have, of course, a new situation, which is the German occupation, but that you have also old reflexes and old landmarks, which are playing a very, very important part. What is very interesting, for example, is the landmarks given by Christianity. This has been certainly a sure, you see, landmark to identify, for example, Nazism as a paganism. So you see, you have very often a firm moral background which helps to be committed in the resistance. But what is very interesting is that we all have moral values, and that's why we are committing ourselves in one action or not. But the important question is certainly not the importance of moral values. The real question is their hierarchy. And I would like just to give you two examples. You have two very rightist and conservative members of the parliament in France. One is not very well known, Henri Becard, and the other is much more well known, Philippe Henriot. The two belong to the same party. The two were Christians. The two were anti-communist, and the two were true patriots. The first, Henri Becard, entered the resistance as soon as 1940. Philippe Henriot became a fierce collaborationist and a fierce collaborator. So why? Why? Because according to Becard, national independence had to prevail. So we have the telegrams sent to Pétain after Montoire in October 1940, and he says, your program is marvelous. You have too much Jews. That's perfect. Okay, but do it after the departure of the Huns. And Henriot, on the contrary, what prevailed was anti-communism. As Germany was launching a crusade against Bolshevism, he had to support this crusade. So you see, landmarks given by the pre-war period, but also hierarchy of the values are very important.
I know there are other people who want to ask questions, but unfortunately I think we've come to the end of our allotted time. I would like on behalf of everybody to thank Shani Pierre and the staff of Maison Française and Columbia University Press. Join me in thanking Professor Paxton and Professor Wiewierka.